But let's get started. Aaron, first off, I hope everyone had a great Memorial Day weekend. I hope folks had a chance for a day off and a little bit of a chance to relax. And Aaron, I hope you did as well.
Yeah, good seeing you again, David. I got my coffee here, even though I'm not on the West Coast. This is early for me to be talking so much. Usually have to kind of work up to that throughout the course of a day. But it's been a couple weeks. I hope you had a good Memorial Day as well. And I was hoping, kind of explaining to you offline that my kids are home today from daycare, so I was really hoping it would be a nice, quiet Friday and we could spend some quality time with the kids. But Trump dropped his note yesterday afternoon about this upcoming press conference with Elon Musk, which actually there's a lot of kind of as echoes of my own life right now because my kids just finished their school year, so they had their last day yesterday, and this is apparently a press conference to commemorate Musk's final day in the White House. Kind of a commencement ceremony of sorts, and Trump made sure in his post on True Social to indicate that Musk is leaving in good standing and that he appreciates his work. Because I think there's been some question about that. With Musk this week, of course, during his CBS News interview, which I think is yet to air in its entirety. But he kind of threw the BBB reconciliation bill under the bus, saying something to the effect of a bill can either be big or beautiful, but not both. And I
Right.
think the implication being that he's not happy with the fact that it's going to add something like 4 trillion to the deficit. But despite that, Trump is usually not one to take criticism very well, but he seemed to take that in stride when he's talked about Musk this week. He's had nice things to say, but I'm interested to see how this press conference goes. I don't think Musk is going to get like the Zelensky treatment in the Oval Office, or the treatment that the South African president got a week ago today, I believe it was, or maybe it was about 10 days ago that happened. But it should be interesting to see, kind of how they tried to spin this, and I'm sure Musk will probably end up being asked to weigh in on BBB by some of the reporters there, and so it should at least be a newsworthy event.
I like this idea, by the way, that Elon Musk is getting his graduation certificate from middle school.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
just like your kids.
No,
Just
I
as
mean,
a
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, just as a reminder to all our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you have a question for us, we will take questions throughout the show. Just drop your question in the chat box there at the bottom. And just as a reminder, to be able to participate in the Q&A, you need to be a paid subscriber either to the Down Ballot, my publication, or to Public Notice, which is Aaron's newsletter. Yeah, so let's get back to Musk talk. Aaron, I'm curious, do you have, before we dive into what's happening today and the big, beautiful bill, do you have a personal theory as to why Trump has given Musk so much greater reign than he ever has anyone else? I mean, I remember, during Trump's first term, there was some magazine cover that puffed up Steve Bannon, and Trump lost his mind, and Bannon was in the doghouse immediately after
Mhm.
that as a result. And Musk has aggrandized far more power to himself. He's openly criticized things that Trump has supported, and yet he's leaving on good terms, which is not something we've really ever seen before. Like, do you have a guess as to why Musk is so different from anyone else who's wound up in Trump's orbit?
Well, I think one part of it is obviously that I think what was the final total? Something like 250 million that Musk spent on Trump's campaign last year. So, obviously he was very important in Trump being back in the White House in the first place, just financially. But I think even beyond that, I mean, I think Elon has a certain online clout that I think Trump probably understands, helps him and would be quite dangerous, if Musk kind of openly turned against Trump and weaponized X to hurt him. I think that would be very bad for Trump too. And then, of course, Musk has been very transparent in his threats, even recently, to use his PAC to, primary House Republicans who aren't on board with Trump's agenda, or even, key senators in upcoming races. And so I think, Musk obviously has kind of paid lip service in recent days to spending less money going forward on political activities. But I think we'll kind of believe that when we see it, sort of thing.
Right.
Because there's even comments last week about how Musk, he said publicly that he was going to be taking a step back from politics, and like the very next day, he was in meetings with key Republicans. Some of the DC reporters were breaking news about that. So I think some of this is kind of. working the public a little bit to, create a perception that Musk is stepping back. And I guess, we'll see to what extent that holds true. But yeah, I think it's the combo of the financial clout that obviously helped Trump last year, the influence that Elon has with a segment of of the Trump base, and right wingers online that I think Trump is eager to remain tapped into. So when you put those together, I think even with Musk, kind of taking a step back from at least spending a lot of time in the White House, if not being involved in the Trump administration, I think Trump still views him as an asset that he would like to, continue being in good graces with and taking advantage of.
That is still remarkably unusual for Trump. I also feel, and this is something that lots of folks have said online, that Trump this term, as opposed to his last term, seems much more interested in and much more content with being more like the head of state rather than the head of government. In these parliamentary countries, you might have a president who represents the country abroad, but the real power of governing is held by the prime minister. And Musk has, in a way, really been the prime minister, or maybe Stephen Miller, or someone not named Trump. Whereas Donald Trump gets to, hold the, well, bill signings are rare, but he gets to sign these executive orders and hold press conferences and go play golf and avoid criminal prosecution. And so it seems like, I don't know, maybe he's just getting older and more tired, and he's happy to farm out the actual duties of quote unquote governing to folks like Musk and Stephen Miller. Though
Mm.
I think on that note, what we have seen in the last 24 or so hours coming from the press, these almost encomiums to Musk
Yeah.
about this brave outsider who was just trying to wrangle the federal budget deficit. And I mean, it's just wild to me how his PR team has managed to spin this vision of him when he was just an ignoramus wrecking ball who wanted to destroy many parts of the federal government, didn't care what he was doing, what the impact of what he was doing, and has ruined people's lives and also damaged this country.
Yeah, for sure. And, as I was kind of prepping for this, I was trying to see what the latest totals are in terms of the Doge, quote unquote, savings. And yeah, I should use it since we're on video here. I can use the air quotes, but I didn't see super updated figures, but the reporting from about a month ago was something in terms of actual receipts of cuts. It was like 8 billion, which is basically close to the amount in this rescissions package that the White House is planning to send to Congress next week, that mainly just cuts funding for public broadcasting. And so, I kind of view the role of Musk as almost like that Homer Simpson meme where he rolls into work at the nuclear power plant and dumps water all over the electronics, and then just, like, my work here is done kind of thing. Because that's, Doge kind of went to a lot of these agencies and, kind of tried to fire a lot of people, tore it down. I think there's still some of that going on. But, beyond that, I mean, the original idea was that Musk was talking last fall about cutting, like trillions of dollars
Right.
from the budget. And, it's an absolute, to call it a drop in the bucket is probably too charitable in terms of what he's
Right.
actually accomplished along those lines. And, I think because a lot of the Doge stuff, has obviously for good reasons kind of taken place out of the public view, in terms of, there's been reporting about this, but, showing up at agencies and, basically trying to kick people out and, pilfering through private data and things like that. It's still even hard today as Musk, kind of winds down at least supposedly his formal role to get a grip on what actually he accomplished or didn't accomplish and what Doge did. And if the end result here is kind of this rescissions package, and there'll probably be more of them, but a spending on the order of like $8 billion. I mean, that's really nothing, for all the hype that Doge got over the months. But I do think that it was kind of the tip of the spear in terms of Trump's lawlessness, the Doge efforts, and the effort to basically cut congressionally appropriated funding without Congress weighing in.
Right.
I think that is kind of a signature aspect of the Trump lawlessness, and I don't think anybody back during the campaign really envisioned Musk playing that sort of role. This idea of Doge, I think, was over about the last month of the campaign, and the idea was that it was going to be this big cost-cutting effort, and that didn't really amount to much. But you did have them kind of invading these agencies and reports about them rifling through data, and I still don't think we have a great sense of what they wanted to get that data for, what the end goal was there, if they were going to exploit it in some way, or if it had something to do with kind of Musk's business interests. But yeah, I mean, I can't say I've read a lot of the soft focus coverage as I was trying to bone up for this day. I was trying
You don't
to
want
get
to.
yeah, I was trying to get a sense of the actual kind of dollar figures and what we actually know about what happened here. But I mean, are there any pieces along those lines that kind of jump out to you that you read or that got your blood pressure rising a little bit?
Honestly, I couldn't stomach that. Josh Marshall was tweeting about it, and that was kind of like that gave me enough exposure. But you referenced a point that I think is really really worth emphasizing because we talk about these Musk cuts, but they aren't actual cuts to the federal government budget. They are just attempts to stop government agencies from spending money that has already been budgeted for them. So,
Mhm.
if Congress says to, this particular government department, we're going to give you $1 billion for the next fiscal year, and Musk's, his teenagers come in and they start canceling contracts and whatever, and that adds up to $500 million, half of that $1 billion. That money has still been spent by Congress, and what happens is that in the next year's budget bill, that agency is probably going to get $1 billion again. The only way for these cuts to actually become permanent is if Congress reduces the budgets for these agencies that takes that $1 billion down to say 500 million. Obviously, that's just an extremely hypothetical example. And despite what we're seeing with the big beautiful bill, and God, that phrase obviously makes me gag. Congress isn't really interested in cutting these budgets in any kind of
Yeah.
permanent way. And so you have these weird situations where like what's going to happen next year where like all this money is ultimately piling up in these bank accounts held by these various government agencies because they stopped spending on things they were planning to spend on. So you haven't actually reduced the budget of anything. And I really don't think Republicans want to.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I mean, another thing to kind of highlight about Doge, I think, is, and this is kind of permeated now, I think, beyond Doge to the White House and Republicans, this conflation of fraud with basically spending that Republicans don't like.
Right.
And I mean, on the point that you were just making, I mean, again, to bring it back to the rescissions package, if there were all these kind of low hanging fruit in terms of cuts, you would see this in the rescissions. And again, basically what it does is defund public broadcasting. And so, if there really were, billions or, possibly even trillions of dollars of fraud or wasteful spending, you would think that Republicans would want to spike the football and have this package that would be a slam dunk. But, there's reporting that even this rescissions package next week, which I think only needs a majority vote in both chambers, like even that's going to be a tough hill to climb because there are a number of House Republicans who in the past have been against defunding public broadcasting. And so, it seems like that's even, questionable whether it's going to get through the House. And so, for all of the kind of shock and awe and, the claims of all of this wasteful and fraudulent spending, I mean, I think we're seeing now that the rubber is kind of hitting the road with some of these rescissions being sent to Congress that there really never was any there.
For those who may not be up to date on all the congressional lingo, what exactly is a rescissions package?
So I believe it's basically, spending that has been appropriated that is then, brought back to be, I don't know, I was going to say, what would be the singular of rescission? I'm not exactly sure, but it's basically a way to
Rescinded?
claw back funding that has been appropriated. And so, it's a way to get Congress, because obviously the Doge cuts have been completely unilateral, as you kind of touched upon, but this is a way to get kind of the congressionally stamped approval on this to reduce spending that has been appropriated. And again, it basically amounts, with this first package at least, to defunding public broadcasting, which, was that ever like a big part of the Doge effort or their messaging? Not really. And I think we kind of see why, because it's a handful of billions of dollars, which, I mean, I guess that sounds like a lot of money, but when you're talking about like a $6 trillion budget, you talk, and when Doge has been talking about reducing spending by like $1 or $2 trillion, I mean, it's nothing in that context.
So let's get back to this bill, the BBB, which I'm sure that part of Trump's impetus, or maybe at the back of his mind, he loves the idea of reappropriating Biden's Build Back Better. Um, but folks have in a way, I feel too many folks have treated the House passing this bill as the final say, that all of the terrible things in this bill are on the verge of becoming law, and they might be. The Senate could completely roll over, but oh man, I feel like those kind of predictions. There's a graveyard for folks who make those kind of predictions, especially about the Senate, because even though Senate Republicans have been so supine toward Trump, when it's one thing to do it on a nomination for a disgusting SOB like Pete Hegseth, but this is a massive bill, and
Mhm.
I feel like there is still a chance for things to go awry or for things to change, and if the Senate changes too much, then it goes back to the House, and it wasn't that easy to get it through the House in the first place. So I feel like there's a lot of game left to be played on this. Is that your feeling as well, or am I being too optimistic?
No, I think that you're right on that. And, just to kind of loop people in on this, I mean, the Senate has been on recess since the holiday and they
Right.
come back next week. And this is, the timeline that the White House has been pushing is to have Trump sign the reconciliation bill by the 4th of July. So you can see that time is starting to run quite short, especially if they have to send it back to the House for another vote after changes are made, which seems quite likely because, not to get too deep in the weeds, but, there's this thing called the Bird Rule, where basically in a reconciliation bill, anything that doesn't pertain to the budget can't be stuffed into a reconciliation bill, and that happens when it gets to the Senate part of the process. And there's a lot of stuff about like public funding of gender affirming care and like some renewable energy stuff that seems like it's at least going to be challenged, and those decisions come down to the Senate parliamentarian, and I don't think anybody really has a great window into how that might play out. But even if Senate Republicans are totally on board, which is already obviously not the case in terms of approving the House bill, it seems like the parliamentarian may end up stripping out parts of the bill that then when it goes back to the House could end up being contentious, since there's such a narrow margin there, and they can only afford to lose, I believe it is 3 or 4 votes at this point. And of course, in the Senate, I mean, there's 53 Republican senators, so they can only afford to lose three in the Senate as well. And you have different senators who have different sorts of issues. Ron Johnson, for one, has been very outspoken to the point of like almost being belligerent toward Trump and saying that
Huh.
I know you can threaten to primary other House Republicans, but like I'm not up until I believe it's 2028 in his case, and those threats aren't going to work against me. Not really like criticizing Trump, but basically saying like, I'm standing my ground on this. I'm not going to cave. He wants more spending cuts. And a lot of Republicans are squeamish over the 4 trillion in added spending that will add, to the debt. Rand Paul has that concern too. And then, of course, you have Murkowski and Collins who are concerned with the Medicaid cuts, as is, kind of a little bit of a surprise, although, maybe not if you've been following this closely, Josh Hawley, because, Missouri is a big Medicaid state. So he's been on record, very strongly saying that he doesn't support the Medicaid cuts. So, there's different concerns, depending on what Republican you're talking about. And, we saw in the House that, certain Republicans were kind of given a hall pass not to vote for it, guys like Massey, and that could end up being the case, in the Senate, where three of them could kind of go that route of doing the
Right.
performative no vote. And, JD Vance could end up breaking a 50-50 tie. But, my sense is that there's some real concerns. And because they are about different parts of the bill, it might be a little more difficult to find like a grand bargain here. And you still have guys like Ron Johnson who are talking about his preference would be to break the bill into two bills, basically one dealing with kind of the easier ticket items, and then a second one possibly dealing with the Medicaid cuts and extending the tax cuts. So there's still kind of talk about kind of blowing this whole process open, or blowing it up and starting over again. But I believe kind of the ticking time bomb here is the debt limit, which I believe we're going to start bumping up against in September. So as we get deeper in the summer, there's going to be more and more pressure on Republicans to get something done. But David, I mean, I think you're right that it can't be completely discounted that Republicans will kind of roll over here and just end up, kind of holding their nose and voting yes on this thing. But it seems to me like that may not happen. So next week will be very key.
Yeah, and the important thing is not to we're not making a prediction, and it's not wise to predict. The important thing is to acknowledge that the process is far from done, and I really think that way too many people, especially in the traditional media, have treated it like a fait accompli. But Aaron, in just a few minutes, you rattled off half a dozen reasons of why this isn't. It's like you press on a balloon, and as soon as you press in one spot, it expands in another spot. And this is a problem with almost any piece of congressional legislation. But as you alluded at the end, it was only because of Trump's delusional ideas that they're doing this one giant ass bill. It's a very strange approach because that just creates so many more failure points. They could have
Mhm.
easily had some successes on stuff where the entire Republican Party agrees, and it still would have been big, still would have gotten a ton of coverage, still would have made them feel good about themselves. It might not have been popular with the public. They don't really seem to care about that, but they really are putting all of their eggs in one basket. Now, that said, it's been quite a while since we have seen, I think, the Senate Republicans tank a bill that Republicans want to pass. It happens all the time in the House because the House is absolutely batshit. Though it's happened less lately, but Mike Johnson, especially last year, lost a whole bunch of votes and needed Democratic support to get must-pass bills passed. But have we seen an instance since John McCain's famous thumbs down on the Obamacare repeal bill where Senate Republicans have actually cast a meaningful vote against a major bill advocated for by Republicans? I realize,
Yeah.
that's like 8 years of history. I'm putting you kind of on the spot, but it does seem to be pretty rare, which means to me what's more likely to happen is that they make changes to the bill, and then the real problem becomes, oh boy, how do we wrangle those cats in the house? The problem, I mean, for
Mhm.
Mike Johnson, a good problem for America.
Yeah, and there is a certain irony in Republicans taking this approach because, of course, for all of the criticism and hatred towards Joe Biden, I mean, Democrats kind of did a similar thing with reconciliation, with like the Build Back Better bill, during Biden's term where they jammed a lot of stuff into it because you really only get basically one bite at the reconciliation apple, and so and of course it avoids the filibuster in the Senate, which is why it's such a key thing, in terms of passing major legislation, because even with Republicans having a majority in both chambers, the filibuster in the Senate would be a difficult thing to overcome. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we could be kind of set up for another type of John McCain thumbs down moment. It's just, it seems kind of bizarre to imagine like Josh Hawley being that guy, kind of standing up for Medicaid.
Right,
I mean, that would be very surreal and kind of like a kind of a through the looking glass moment. But again, he's been on on Fox, on Newsmax, on channels that Trump pays attention to, making the case against Medicaid cuts, and and that's been interesting to me because, of course, part of the messaging coming from Mike Johnson has been, no, we're actually not cutting Medicaid. It's just the waste, fraud, and the abuse.
right, right, right,
We're
right,
kicking the illegal immigrants off, and then you listen to Josh Hawley, who at least on this one particular issue that does affect his constituents more than, for instance, a Ron Johnson, where Wisconsin is not a Medicaid expansion state.
right.
So it's easier for him to kind of say, I want even deeper Medicaid cuts than it is for someone like Josh Hawley, where this is actually hurting his constituents. And I guess I think Hawley is a pretty loathsome character, obviously, overall, but at least on this particular item, he is kind of shooting straight and not going the route of kind of lying to his constituents and saying, like, oh, no, we're not going to take your Medicaid away. It's just going to be, the illegal immigrants are going to be losing their coverage. He's kind of leveling with people and explaining that it would be bad for Missouri. Again, they can afford to lose three. Murkowski and Collins seem like the likely candidates there, and maybe Hawley ends up being the other guy who gets kind of a hall pass here to take a no vote. And but again, Ron Johnson has been very categorical, and so has Rand Paul, in saying that this bill doesn't cut enough. There's too much spending. It's going to add to the debt. And at that point, if they end up trying to do deeper cuts, then send it back to the House. I mean, you're going to have some of the purple district, the people like the Mike
Right.
Lawlers of the world, who then that becomes a more difficult vote for them. So it is, to find that balance is really challenging. I was actually sort of impressed, I guess, to you never have to hand it to him, but that Mike Johnson
Never.
was able to get to yes on this bill in the first place. It seemed like that was going to be difficult to get through the House, and he did manage to do that. But it's only going to get harder from here for him if there another vote has to be taken. So, again, time is starting to run a little bit short on this if they're going to meet the July 4th deadline, which I think is more of a symbolic one. But
Yeah,
if it
obviously.
does get deeper into the summer, then there's going to be real macroeconomic concerns that we could hit the default on America's debt or something like that in the fall. And that was an easier thing to kind of grandstand about, make threats about when Biden was president. But when Trump is president,
Right.
if you blow up the economy and you have Republicans controlling both chambers, that's a pretty hard thing to message.
So we have a really good question from Deborah S., which I want to get to in a second. But I want to point out something interesting about Medicaid expansion in Missouri that you mentioned, Aaron. which is that Medicaid expansion was only passed in Missouri at the ballot box. It was done against the wishes of Republicans who dominate the state government there. And that's been the case in a number of red states. And so it's so interesting to me that Josh Hawley now is totally bought into Medicaid expansion, even though Republicans were bitterly opposed and it had to be done over their heads. And you
Mm.
can see why they've opposed it in the first place, because once you expand it, it winds up being very popular. And so if a guy like Josh Hawley can be turned against his will into a Medicaid supporter, a Medicaid expansion supporter, that's a pretty interesting phenomenon to me and points to the problems that we have been talking about. So let's get to Deborah's question. She asks, what about the parts of the bill? Oh, sorry, I just lost the question. Apologies, Deborah. Give me a
I think I
second
see it.
to.
I see it
Oh,
here. I see it here.
good.
She said, "What about the parts of the bill that seem to give Trump power to ignore courts as well as other increased powers? Do you have any insight on that?" So, the one thing I can say on that, it is very technical, but there is an aspect of the bill that basically would make it harder for courts to enforce contempt citations, I believe, and that is one
Yep.
actually, from what I've gathered, that is at risk of not complying with the Byrd rule because that is not really a budgetary thing. So I have seen some Democrats. It came up very in a very compelling way. Joe Neguse, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, from
Negus.
Colorado, the
Yep.
Neguse. During the Rules Committee, the overnight hearing that they held just before the vote, really made an impassioned case that that's a bad idea, and kind of highlighting the downsides of that, sort of neutering courts and judges. And so my understanding is that that is one that will be challenged under the Byrd rule criteria and might not meet the bar there, which would result in it being stripped from the bill.
Yeah, one thing to remember about the parliamentarian is that the Senate can vote to override their recommendations. The parliamentarian is not some super legislator with some,
True.
extraordinary level of power. And in fact, recently Republicans did seek to circumvent the parliamentarian in regard to another issue. Um, but also, just because something gets passed doesn't mean it won't be litigated. In fact, I absolutely would expect anything uh, affecting Trump and the executive branch's relationship with the judicial branch to be litigated, and courts could find those sorts of things to be unconstitutional. Obviously, they've been ruling against Trump right and left in a whole variety of cases. So, yeah, just even if some of those kinds of provisions pass, that I would definitely expect there to be legal fights. And contempt is a particularly important. Civil contempt, this is a very strong power that the courts have. Aaron, one of your writers, Lisa Needham, has written about this. I'm not sure for public notice, but I think at Daily Kos, when you have the power of civil contempt, a court can impose fines on the Trump administration or its officers. And they can, for instance, have those fines double every day. So they can start at $10,000 a day, and the next day it's 20,000, and then it's 40,000. And we all understand the power of exponents. And in fact, in a case involving Elon Musk, before he got involved with Doge, he faced similar kinds of contempt fines. And he backed down after just a few days because
Mm.
all of a sudden you're staring down millions or even billions of dollars in fines after a month or two. So it's a very strong power, and we haven't seen courts use that yet. They really need to, is my opinion.
Yeah.
I hope we will. I hope that these judges, these district court judges, are just trying to get their ducks in a row to ensure that any contempt findings stand up on appeal, especially with the Supreme Court. But I think that we will start to see some contempt findings happen reasonably soon, just because we see Trump ignoring all of these court orders all the time. It's a slow motion constitutional crisis. We had another question from Jesse Bacon. I like this question. Uh, Thoughts on if Doge will be able to work more effectively without the glare of Musk, or less effectively because they won't have their champion? I mean, Jesse, I think you nailed it right there with the question. It could absolutely go either way. I tend to feel that Musk and Aaron, we haven't even talked about the story today about his rampant drug use. But
I think I missed the story.
Oh boy! All right. Well, we'll get to
Okay.
that in a second
All
then.
right.
But I feel like Musk is one of these figures who he has got this frenetic energy and he can drive things in a certain way, and he has Trump's ear, and he sends his little Muskenjugend into all of these federal agencies, and these agencies feel the need to respond because they know Musk is at the top of the food chain and he has Trump's ear. And so I tend to feel that if Musk really does dial himself out, and again, we don't know if he really will, I tend to feel this kind of effort could sputter because then some 22-year-old with the nickname Big Balls is showing up at your federal agency. I learned that from you, Aaron,
Yep.
and demanding access to your systems and telling you to cut all these contracts, and you're like, who the fuck are you?
Mm.
And so I tend to think it's more likely to sputter without him than with him. I don't know. What's your feeling there?
Yeah, I don't know if people saw the moment from the White House press briefing yesterday where a reporter basically asked, oh, G. Elliot Morris says, hey, 20-year-olds can be smart, true.
They can. They
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. Anyway, where a reporter asked Carolyn Levitt, who will be the leader of Doge now that Musk is stepping away, and she basically said,
Oh, right.
Doge is all of us now. She was like
Right.
all of the cabinet, all of the heads of the cabinet, and the president himself is one of the leaders of Doge. And I saw some people speculating that's kind of a convenient way to shield yourself from legal liability a little bit too, by basically saying there is no Doge leader. It's just kind of all of us now. And I believe in filings that it was a woman who I believe her name is like Amy Gleason, who has been announced as who I don't know who that is, but who has been disclosed to be the leader of Doge. Because remember, this was a controversy a couple
Yes.
months
Yes.
ago where
Yep. Yep.
and they wouldn't say who was the leader of Doge. And then in certain court filings, they had to announce that this woman Amy Gleason, who's the leader of Doge. But yeah, I mean, so to me, the sense that I got from that is that they're kind of absorbing elements of this into the different cabinet agencies, but that Doge as kind of a separate entity is kind of going away, and being absorbed to the extent that the work continues by the different departments.
I mean, my feeling this whole, I am Spartacus moment for Doge, to me, that only increases your legal liability because now if you're involved in a lawsuit where Doge is one of the parties, you can call any any cabinet member in for a deposition and insist they show up. I mean, maybe a court won't allow it, but I don't know. It feels like they're sticking their necks out in a weird way. And Carolyn Levitt, I don't exactly think she is a genius legal mind who has
No.
figured out the one weird trick to avoid legal liability here.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that with briefings like that, she's competent to the extent that she clearly is kind of briefed on things. She anticipates questions in a way that I do think she's prepared for these briefings. So my sense in listening to that was that that is kind of the line, is that that Doge, there is no like new Elon Musk. They're just kind of
Right.
winding it down basically. And maybe maybe the legal aspect that might be putting more thought into it than they did really, but I thought the fact that she kind of spun it that way was telling that, like, Doge is kind of going the way of the dinosaur here.
Right. So yeah, if you haven't read it, we don't really need to get into it, but I think it was in the New York Times today, new reporting on Musk's alleged drug use. And I don't have it right in front of me, but the stories are that he would travel with a box filled with pills,
Hmm.
and said that he was using ketamine so much it was affecting his bladder, which is known to be a side effect of excessive ketamine use. Yeah, it's some really troubling stuff that
Interesting.
I mean, are they going to take good questions at this press conference? I mean, surely some
Oh
reporter
yeah.
is going to have to ask about this.
I mean, maybe, the thing with these Oval Office press briefings now is that, the White House picks the reporters who
Right,
are there.
right,
And so, you always, it's a very weird spectacle where Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, I believe the guy's name is like Brian Glenn, who, he's a correspondent for, it's like even, he was on Right Side Broadcasting, but now it's like even further out there, the network that he
right,
works for. But, he's like the hype man for some of these briefings. If you remember, he was the guy during the Zelensky debacle who was, he was the guy who was haranguing him about his wardrobe and kind of like, you
right,
couldn't wear
right,
a
right. Of
suit.
course.
So it's a very, and then when there are reporters who kind of sneak through the cracks and end up being legit reporters who ask questions, Trump makes a point of saying like, "What outlet are you with?" Kind of
Right.
where it's almost kind of like marking them for like, "You're not going to be here next time because I'm going to make sure that you're not invited." And so, at the same time, you do usually get like an NBC reporter or like a CBS. Rachel Scott from ABC has been at a lot of these events, so I'm sure there will be some questions, but my sense is that no one's going to bring up the drug use. But I actually regret that I missed that. I mean, I get up in the morning and my routine is to rip through all of the shows, for clips, and so sometimes it takes me until about midday to catch up on the big Times articles. But that at least sounds like an entertaining read, if not breaking a lot of new ground, because I think we've kind of known, just looking at some of Elon's behaviors and the fact that he
Yeah.
loves posting at like 3:30 a.m. It's like, okay, why are you? I guess some people just have insomnia where they're up all night, but I don't think anybody's surprised to learn that there might be, some performance enhancement. I don't know if enhancement's the right word, but some
And
performance altering going on there.
altering.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. But before we run out of time, I did want to get to the other item we were going to talk about, which is Tommy Tuberville,
Oh yeah.
which I believe is the correct pronunciation. It's Tuberville, not Tubberville, right? Actually, he was on Fox the other day, and Will Kane, in introducing the segment, pronounced his name incorrectly, and I believe he called him Tuberville. I think Tubberville is the correct pronunciation. But in any event, I guess maybe we'll have to know less about how to pronounce his name, since he is apparently leaving the Senate to run for governor. And I got to say, when I saw this news, he announced it actually on Fox, and I think the very same interview where Will Kane mispronounced his name earlier this week. And I was kind of, they were teasing this big announcement that he was going to make, and it never occurred to me that he was running for governor. I mean, I guess I was really kind of confused about what it could possibly be, because, again, like, Republicans have the majority. So it's not like one of these no hope gigs where, like, being a House member when you're in the minority and all you can do is really kind of like message. You can actually get things done to a point in the Senate right now. And of course, there's all these questions about where he actually lives. It seems like he lives in Florida, which, if you're running for governor, seems even maybe weirder than being a senator. So what's your kind of sense? I mean, is it just that being
Yeah.
governor of Alabama is really like not, or being senator, I should say, is really not that great of a gig, or what's going on there?
You nailed it, Aaron. Tommy Tuberville, he was only elected to the Senate in 2020. He is in the middle of his first term, and he is already saying that he wants to bail. And he has been talking about or hinting at a bid for governor. The governorship is open right now because the current incumbent Kay Ivey is term limited. He has been talking about this for quite some time. And earlier this year, when he was first asked about the possibility, he said, "I can't say that I've enjoyed being in D.C." That's
Hmm.
almost an exact quote. And it's like, wow, you've been there for just 4 years and you're already hating life. Now, I want to ask your opinion on something, but I'll finish up my thoughts on this. It really does feel telling to me that you have yet another senator who wants to bail
Hmm.
because in Tennessee, Marshall Blackburn is almost certainly going to run for governor. And then you have one on the Democratic side in Colorado. Michael Bennet is running for governor there. You see governors often run for the Senate, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Governors are often term limited. Senators only have to face election every 6 years. You very rarely see senators become governors. It almost never
Hmm.
happens, occasionally. But so you have a whole bunch of these folks who are looking to bail, and it just feels telling to me. At the same time, Tommy Tuberville is not well liked among fellow Republicans. You might remember a few years ago, he lost his mind over the fact that the military was paying for service members after Dobbs to travel to states where abortion was still legal so that they could receive abortion care. And for like more than a year, or around a year, he held up promotions of top brass in the military. And fellow Republicans were furious with him because he was harming military preparedness because, top generals couldn't get their promotions, or, colonels couldn't get promoted to general, et cetera. And he finally caved on that. And so I think Republicans in the Senate will be glad to see him go. He is obviously going to be glad to go. And you also mentioned the residency thing. And that is potentially real trouble because if you're running
Hmm.
for Congress, there are very few requirements on you. Mostly it has to do with age, and you just have to live in the state that you're representing at the time that you're sworn into Congress. But many states have much stricter rules around running for state office, like governor. And in Alabama, you have to have been a resident of the state for 7 years to be able to run for governor. But there's a lot of questions about how long Tuberville has actually been an Alabama resident. You mentioned this Florida stuff. These questions came up before his first Senate campaign in 2020. Now, Tuberville has just about cleared the field in the race for governor. So, and Republicans have no interest in challenging his residency, but Alabama Democrats say that they're going to bring a challenge. Who knows how the courts will receive it? He could wind up skating on this, but it really would be hilarious, Aaron, if Tommy Tuberville says, I'm bailing on the Senate, a whole bunch of people pile into the Senate race, and then some court says, you're not actually eligible to run for governor of Alabama, buddy. I mean, I don't think that's what's going to happen, but I'm crossing my fingers.
Yeah, and what is that race? Now there's obviously a vacuum. I guess two-part question. Number one, are there
Yeah.
any kind of prominent Alabama Republicans who seem like a good, a likely candidate for Tuberville's seat that he's vacating in the Senate? And then I have seen, and to me it strikes me as kind of wish casting online. This idea that Dems could possibly win that seat, that seems highly unlikely. Of course, we did have Roy Moore, the disaster candidate that led to, and unfortunately I'm blinking on the Democrat's name who have
Doug
that seat.
Jones.
Doug Jones, that's right. So I don't know if something like that is feasible again, but what's your read on that?
I mean, Doug Jones, absolutely remarkable candidate. He was a fantastic senator, and he was the beneficiary of multiple miracles in that
Yeah,
race, that special election in 2017. He has floated, or he hasn't ruled out the idea of running either for governor or senator. I think that he's probably unlikely to. And look, we saw what happened in 2020 when he ran for a full term. He barely beat Roy Moore in 2017, a miraculous race. And then he got crushed by Tubberville by like 20 points in 2020 when he ran for a full term. Maybe things could be different in a gubernatorial election. We generally see that folks are more willing to split their tickets in races for governor than for Senate. That's why you have, governors like, or former governors like Larry Hogan in Maryland, Republican, or Steve Bullock in Montana, Democrat. It's the longest of long shots. In terms of the Senate race to replace Tuberville, this is what I wanted to ask you. There's a
okay,
million candidates. I would just be rattling off names if I got into it.
yeah.
It's not even worth it. I think it's going to be a very contentious primary. That's what we've seen before. In my opinion, Aaron, Tommy Tuberville is a potential contender for the dumbest member of the Senate. And you have probably watched far more
Yeah.
clips of Senate Republicans than just about anyone else. Where do you rank him?
He's right up there. I'd put Roger Marshall as kind of a dark horse because he's one of these guys who, well,
Interesting.
because he's a doctor, but he's like one of the worst on like vaccines, and so yeah, I think it comes more out of a place of malice rather than ignorance. But he'd be up there. Boy, I feel like I'm forgetting a lot of obvious names here. I mean, most people, and even Tuberville, to his credit, when he goes on Fox, he's able to kind of play the hits and do the red meat, and he's on Newsmax and Fox all the time, and he does say a lot of, really dumb stuff that I end up clipping and posting. But again, I'm not, yeah, he does seem quite ignorant to me, I guess. But I think I have kind of a special disdain for guys like Marshall who should know better, but are kind of like anti-vaccine and
Right.
anti-public health. Man, it's a really crowded field. I mean, even a guy like I mean, Ron Johnson, he says a lot of stuff that I really, think is reprehensible, but at least when it comes to talking about like the nation's finances, he seems to have like a grasp on reality and and budgeting and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I can't really disagree with that, to be honest with you. I think that if you wanted to make a case that Tuberville is the dumbest senator, I would accept that.
Well, there will be competition for a replacement come 2027
Yeah.
because he's very unlikely to remain in the Senate. Well, we should wrap up. We're
Yeah.
about a quarter till. Thank you, everyone. We had almost 1,000 folks tuning in despite our earlier hour. Next week, we will be back at our usual time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, on Near and Rupar. As always, if you have not yet subscribed to Public Notice, Aaron's newsletter on Substack, you should please do that, publicnotice.co, or find it in the Substack app. My publication, The Down Ballot, is the-downballot.com. Again, also Just plug the name into the Substack app and you'll find it. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We had some really great questions. We had G. Elliot Morris trolling us. I appreciated that, Elliot. I thought
Yeah.
that was really funny. So yeah, don't hesitate to mix it up in the comments. We love it.
Yeah.
Thank you
Good.
all for joining us and have a great weekend.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I'll put some more thought into the dumbest senator conversation.
Yes,
So
I think you need to tweet out your
I was
list, your top
unprepared for
five.
that. Yeah, I was unprepared for that. But it's actually, now that I'm kind of thinking about it, it's like, okay, there are a lot of even John Kennedy from Louisiana. There's some good candidates there.
Oh
So
yeah, you
so
might
tune in
need two
next week for more
categories.
conversation about that.
You might need
Yes.
two categories. You know, like just absolute dumbest versus like willfully dumb. You
Yes,
know,
because Kennedy isn't. Yeah, Kennedy is another one who isn't dumb, but he kind of plays dumb on TV.
right,
So it's a
right.
little
He
hard
was a
to kind
Rhodes
of
Scholar.
exactly. So but tune in next week. We'll talk more about that. So
All right, bye
yeah,
everybody. Thank
bye.
you.